Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and this is my review of Smash Up's new Backtimers faction. Backtimers introduce a new mechanic called Stasis that you may have seen previews for. You know what I love more than anything? Starting videos with disclaimers. Even more so than last week, I need to stress that this is my review, not a preview, and that difference is crucial. This video was incredibly challenging to make because it is fair to ask whether or not I am reviewing Backtimers, Stasis, or both. Because of how Stasis is incorporated into Backtimers, I feel like it has to be both. This is also challenging because some of my main points won't mean anything to many players, but this is a big deal for me. If Stasis came out 10 expansions ago, if I felt like it was going to be a major organic part of the game system, I would feel differently. But I honestly believe that we will never see this mechanic again, that it exists solely as a thematic means to an end. I always prefer to state my biases up front so that I can explore it over the course of this video, and this just isn't for me. It's important to note that I've talked to several others who have the same issues with Stasis, so it's not just me, I just happen to be the one who has to publicize my thoughts. But Stasis and Backtimers also have their fans, so it's not all doom and gloom, but your mileage may vary. With that context out of the way, let's take a deeper look at Backtimers and Stasis together, starting with their 5-card identity. Their leader is Alex P. McGlide, who can put 2 Stasis counters on a card in your hand. This is followed by 99 miles per hour, putting a card in Stasis, and Back from the Future, putting a card in Stasis. That is a consistent identity, joined by other cards that put a card in Stasis, put a card in Stasis, put a card in Stasis, or put up to 2 cards in Stasis. If you are counting at home, that is 11 out of 20 cards that put a card into Stasis, potentially 12 there total. That isn't a good ratio right off the bat, because it means that you don't have a lot of room for cards that want to be in Stasis or cards that help with Stasis manipulation. And I can't understate how I've literally gone through half the faction in about a minute because all their cards are doing the same thing. It's particularly disappointing how similar the 2 double features are. They have 2 zany profs that can manage Stasis, but those wouldn't be good candidates because they speed up your throughput. The best candidate to go into Stasis is the Backtimer Recruit, which is quite strong. To understand why, we need to understand what Stasis actually is. It is a staging area for cards that will be played on future turns, which in a vacuum is a good thing. I often talk about equity in my videos, which I define as things you lose or gain based on a card remaining in play. Those things are almost always power counters and attachments, with turns being a rare third case, but Stasis uses turns as a resource at its core. And I like that, but the problem is its rule set and how Backtimers utilize it. When a card enters Stasis, either on its own or when a card puts it there, it gains Stasis counters. At the start of your turn, each card in Stasis loses one of its Stasis counters. During Phase 2, if you have any card in Stasis with no counters, you can play it as an extra card, with the same timing as if you were using a talent. This actually gives you better granularity as to when to play the cards because it makes your turns super flexible. However, I think that is a bad thing, as it makes a strong mechanic even stronger because you get to maximize the order of events. And Stasis is so strong because there really isn't anything other players can do about it. It is extremely low risk. Compare this to burying. Burying is tethered to the base, so if I destroy the base or break it, burying is thwarted. It's why the Titan Sphinx got the ability that it did. In fact, I can even ransack a buried card. But with Stasis, cards cannot interact with Stasis without explicitly mentioning it, and these aren't my words, but I've talked to other players who describe the Stasis rules as playing solitaire and having the worst of both worlds. I've read it several times, but the being in Stasis section makes little sense and is incomplete. In fact, I even interpreted one of its statements wrong recently. This section basically needs to answer whether or not the cards are in play. If you put a soldier into Stasis, can Seeing Stars destroy it? The answer is no. The card is in play, but they may not be affected by or chosen by any card unless it specifically refers to Stasis. However, this is immediately contradicted in a subsequent statement that their power and abilities can be copied by other cards. This makes every card a case-by-case basis because you couldn't butting a card in Stasis, but you could copycat it, and that just feels wrong, especially since their abilities do not work, yet I can still copy them. If I expected to see this mechanic again, I would put more weight on the omissions, including a known rules hole I'd rather not draw attention to because I don't have time to go into something that is still undecided, but it really comes across as just a headache and technical debt. In my opinion, there were two ways to do it. Let them be interactable, or don't. AEG tried to go halfway, and I think that's what other players mean when they say they got the worst of both worlds. So in the context of the Backtimer recruit, it can put itself into stasis. It will get one stasis counter. At the start of your next turn, it will lose that stasis counter. It will place a power counter on one of your minions on a base. Note the addition of the phrase, on a base, which I consider to be a phrase of technical debt because, in theory, you could remove that phrase and the card would function the same, since it doesn't say that the minion can be in stasis. Then in Phase 2, since the Backtimer recruit has no stasis counters, it can be played normally and gain a power counter. Like burying, cards leaving stasis cannot re-enter stasis, so Backtimer recruits cannot hang out indefinitely. Still, this is an easy 4-power addition that yes costs a turn, but safely approaches a base from a power standpoint. And it gets even stronger as the card you put into stasis with most cards, since you get another free counter as a slow drip. Many players have seen the Backtimer recruit in previews before, and noticed that Lifelong Bully can add stasis counters, and they even use phrases like Power Counter Factory. And I think that is theoretical. In my experience, I have never used the Bully to prolong a card in stasis because it is much more valuable to keep the train going. This is a faction with an extreme chance to snowball, especially since you can't really stop it. Yes, you could destroy the minion who gets the Backtimer recruit counter, but now I only get an easy 3 instead of 4. And while it's good that the Backtimer recruit can put itself into stasis, it's also good that it wants to be put into stasis by other cards because that actually makes it stronger. The same cannot really be said of the other cards. Future Almanac is actually weaker if another card puts it in stasis. Not by a lot, but still noticeable. The reason I point this out is because I don't like Mystic Studies as an action play, so drawing only 2 cards, but having to wait for them feels unsatisfying. Or maybe Mystic Studies looks better in hindsight. The value of the Almanac is probably tied to which card puts it into stasis, as Bully would be more valuable than 99 miles per hour in my opinion, even with the card draw from 99 miles per hour. In theory, the stasis manipulation leads up to a payoff in Lightning Strike, but I believe this card was nerfed into uselessness. Lightning Strike starts with 2 stasis counters. It will lose 1 every turn, but it can also gain 1 when another stasis card loses a counter. The highest you'd want is 5, and that is how much you can rampage a base, but it costs an action play. So this is a 2-play card, 1 play to put it in stasis, and specifically an action play to trigger its ability. And the payoff is limited to 5, but I found it to be quite difficult to get it to be 5. If you have another card in stasis, that will cancel it out for a turn. So you need to spam stasis. While the prof can add stasis counters, it would likely be better to remove an additional counter which produces the same effect. It creates faster turns, which takes away Lightning Strike's own future loss. Lightning Strike is in many ways a crystal clear snapshot of stasis and Smash Up's recent direction for faction balance. Myself and some others tend to look at individual cards with a sort of no card left behind mentality, whereas the official party line is that they really only care about faction balance and aren't trying to balance every card necessarily. The problem is that Lightning Strike and others come across as a scapegoat. In the case of Lightning Strike, it has a cap of 5, and if that cap is deserved, it meant that given the rate at which counters come off, you need to have a ton of cards in stasis, which is the real problem. As for Lightning Strike, it comes across as 2 plays and a ton of work for what other cards do in a one-shot. And Backtimers are so strong that it doesn't even matter that Lightning Strike is basically unusable. In my experience, there is often a 3-turn life cycle of a base. Backtimers can set up 2 to 3 cards on turn 1, all of which are synchronized to fire in turn 3, and even though you know what they are, you have no idea where they are going, or what order, and you can't stop it. One of the key metrics I use for Backtimers is what I am doing with my stasis plays beyond breaking a base. If everything I had in stasis was just in pursuit of breaking a base, that would be one thing. But I find myself getting a head start on the next base or using additional plays for restocking. I get to break a base and still have leftover plays. So if you synchronize properly, it's like playing in turbo mode. But here's the craziest thing. I'm not sure I've even hit their ceiling yet. Going back to the idea of reviewing stasis versus reviewing Backtimers, it would be easy to think that stasis is fundamentally okay, but the Backtimers usage is the problem. And outside of the increasing number of unanswerable questions, that could possibly be true. But why create stasis now? One of my problems with it is now we have 3 mechanics that essentially all do the same thing. deferred extra plays, but playing specific cards instead of generic ones, and allowing for hand size manipulation. Between burying, stasis, and storing, they are all extremely similar in their result, but differ in their method and interactions. And now all are competing for the same screen time, making it harder that we will see any of them. Of the three, storing has the best runway because it is theme agnostic. Look, I like brainstorming new mechanics and tinkering, but at this point in a game's maturity, I believe it is reasonable to ask if we are doing it in a way that feels natural and organic as opposed to newness for the sake of newness. Newness that we will never see again. When other players point out that AEG has revisited mechanics like talents, power counters, and titans, I would point out that talents and power counters, in addition to being early and clearly ubiquitous, are also theme agnostic. And I can't explain why power counters didn't appear in Pretty Pretty. While titans have reappeared, they haven't done so natively, and their reappearance is always a retroactive band-aid and not, hey, we have a cool new idea for a titan. But the thematic mechanics like madness, monsters, treasures, burying, dueling, those we don't see returning. Yes, skeletons brought back burying, but that was 4 years and close to 30 factions later. And that was when it was the only deferred extra play technique in existence. Now it has to compete with 2 others. If you carve into burying's design space, what on earth would you do with it then? Antagonistic burying? I am extremely confident that we will see storing again. I really can't say the same for Stasis. It comes across as a decision to parody Back to the Future and decide the mechanic later. Here's the simple fact. It would have been extremely easy to include one Stasis card in another faction, like Samurai had dueling, because you already had the rules in the rulebook, but they didn't, and that's noticeable. Surely someone like the Extramorphs could have put someone in a Stasis pod, but it didn't happen, so when is it going to happen again? And as a result, the execution of Stasis doesn't do enough to warrant Stasis being fundamentally different from the others. The act of being in Stasis and having that matter is in the minority of these cards. The majority of cards just put a card in Stasis, and by sheer mathematics, it will be your partner faction, because you would have no reason to choose Back from the Future with 99 miles per hour or Alex P. McGlide. What about seeing Stasis turn any card into a mole or lightning rescue type, where you are rewarded for timing everything correctly? That would feel earned in a space that lightning rescue often makes it feel cheap. In fact, Stasis seems intimately unaware of its own existence. When you look at Pharaoh and burying, Pharaoh is at least somewhat aware that, either by base or future faction, someone else might uncover a card. It's a small example, but it is at least an example of separating burying from Egyptians or acknowledging that control-based factions are a thing. With Backtimers, literally every card that cares about Stasis cares about your cards in Stasis, not cards in Stasis, and this is a real missed opportunity, because rival cards can enter Stasis. With Bully, it feels like a fake choice, that everyone always chooses the bottom or. But consider this. If Bully could add a counter to any card in Stasis, that Bully could slow you down and stop your play for a turn, that would be much more interesting. It would be what a Bully does. Lightning Strike could absorb counters from any card in Stasis. These are small steps, but they at least acknowledge that there is a greater impact on the system than just playing solitaire, and the lack of inclusion is disappointing. There is something poetic about a modern faction about time travel having no future-proofing. Despite all this, there is one thing I do think Backtimers do well, and it's something that I wish was explored more, and that is manipulating the basic Stasis rates. While Almanac loses out by 99 miles per hour, cards like Letter from Another Time and Help from the Past benefit from it because it accomplishes the same goal but a turn faster. I wish there were more granularity on the numbers so that this type of speed up was more frequent. When I first read Disrupt the Space-Time Continuum, I viewed it purely from a partner perspective. Why play one card next turn when I could play 2 cards in 2 turns? Greater impact with no additional risk. Then I realized that I could shortchange 2 turns of setup, and it makes me wonder why this isn't more of a focus. When you view it from that perspective, the ratio does shift slightly more balanced. I can't state this enough. It is really hard to separate Backtimers and Stasis, and it makes you wonder, artificially capping a card, 2 really if you count Disrupt the Space-Time Continuum, and the rules limiting interaction, if this is really better off sent back to the drawing board. For more casual players, they won't be bothered by this as much, and they'll love this faction because it literally works with everything. Everyone loves extra plays. But as someone who has built this channel on seeing factions as part of an ecosystem, advancing the competitive nature of the game, and working hard to promote design elegance, it's hard to view this as anything but a step backward. Like the lessons and fan feedback from the past years mean nothing, and you lose sight of what made you great in the first place. To see Stasis in action, you need to think of it as extra plays plus hand size, since cards in Stasis are an extension of your hand. While some players may think that there is an element of telegraphing here, I found that it also comes across as pressure, forcing someone to factor in your game plan knowing they can't exactly stop it, but they can't risk solos so they have to spread out. Take dinosaurs for example. You can seed an augmentation well in advance that can be met with a King Rex and Rampage for 22 damage anywhere, and only one of those cards is seeded in advance. Or you can do all three and take an entirely separate turn. You can use your Stasis cards to put 2 Armor Stegos in Stasis to get all of them out at once and create a shield, and you don't need them all in your hand at the same time. With War Raptors, you can have a similar effect, but it ends on your turn. Now while other factions can play extra minions or extra actions, how many of them give you the flexibility of playing cards to go in either direction? How many of them let you play 3 to 4 minions of uncapped power with relative ease? How many factions extend your hand size in doing so? That's why I'm concerned I haven't even hit the ceiling of Backtimers, because it's easy to see how they exceed the quantity and quality of extra plays that other factions are used to, and with the relative well-roundedness of modern factions, you are less concerned about what you hit because it's going to work out. As I wrap this up, I do want to acknowledge that there is something to be said for taking risks this late in a game's maturity, which is certainly true of action heroes. For me, right now, Stasis just feels wrong, compounded by the fact that I believe, until evidence shows otherwise, that it is a one-and-done mechanic, and Backtimers have no identity outside of it, and the faction lacks nuance as a result. It's very similar to how I feel about Skeletons, leaving me desperate for an implementation of the Rule of Thirds. However, it would not surprise me if other players end up loving them, and that is what will matter most, the general perception. Making a review like this is never easy, but I would be disingenuous to say other than how I really feel. So what do you think of Backtimers and Stasis? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, let's shut it down.